and I'm the scholarly communication librarian at Washington State University. So for the last couple of years, I have been one of the LPC fellows. And so in this presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience as a fellow. And because my work has largely been focused on accessibility in library publishing, that's therefore going to be the focus of what I talk about. So I wanted to look a little bit at some lessons that I've learned about accessibility in the last couple of years, as well as roles that I see for libraries in accessibility work. But before I get to this, I thought it made sense to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about my personal experience with accessibility, which more generally would be my personal experience with disability. So I was a little about me. I was born blind. And so in these pictures, you see me as a baby shortly after my first surgery. I had cataract eye surgery before I was a year old. And following surgery, recovered some of my vision, but not all. My vision is around a little better than legally blind, which is a definitional thing that I won't get into. Um, in the second picture, you can see me a little later in life because I ended up having additional surgeries about 4 years ago due to additional eye issues. So, talking about my personal relationship to disability, I would say that through much of my life, I have largely chosen not to talk about it. It's something that I didn't want to address. I didn't want to ask for accommodations or in any way acknowledge it. And I would say that this more recent experience with surgeries, I ended up having 3 surgeries in 2 months' time, 2 of which were emergency procedures with potential for losing vision entirely. It just led me on a bit of a journey towards thinking more about my identity as disability being part of my identity. One of the things that I ended up looking at a little more recently was models of disability. And this might be something that you're already well familiar with, but it was really insightful for me. Um, so, with models of disability, often traditionally we've talked about kind of this medical model of disability. This goes back to sort of the Enlightenment, really. And in the medical model, essentially, an individual is seen as having the problem, the disability, and the medical community is seen as sort of the cure that's going to make this better. More recently, the medical model has shifted more towards social models of disability, which talk about how society tends to create structures that essentially create disability by making it difficult for people with disabilities to participate in whatever it might be. So this cartoon kind of enacts that social model. It shows a person in a wheelchair who is nominally being invited into a space, and yet they have to go up a staircase to get there. So really, in effect, they're not able to participate. So there are additional kind of more nuanced discussions about models of disability that I won't get into. But what I wanted to say here is that for me, the social model of disability was both really personally insightful, and also it was something that helped me to sort of think more about my own role in libraries and how I potentially am participating in kind of structural creation of barriers for people. So, as a scholarly communication librarian, one of the main ways that I was thinking about this was related to the institutional repository. So, with the IR, as again, I'm sure you're familiar, uh, we have this vision of open access, this very democratic vision of making information available to all people. And unfortunately, as part of that vision, disability wasn't perhaps one of the considerations. So we've ended up with IRs that have accessibility issues both on the platform level and also with the individual content. And one paper that helped me really think about this was by Liebler and Cunningham, where they talked about the issues with accessibility in the IR. Last year, at the kind of the beginning of the pandemic, I wanted to look more at accessibility in IRs. And so a colleague and I did a survey to kind of assess what the accessibility strategies were for IR managers right now. And the survey largely kind of confirmed or echoed some of my own experiences. What we found is that about half of respondents said that this isn't something that's really risen to the surface for them. And then for other respondents, they talked about a range of barriers that they face in doing accessibility work that include things like staffing limitations, lack of training, and lack of time. As I continue to really think about accessibility and my own sort of position in all of this in libraries, a book that I found again really insightful is by Jay Dolmage, Academic Ableism, and he really talks about how universities historically were structured as really kind of an antithesis of disability. Um, it was not only that disability was often the object of study at the university, but also that it was viewed as kind of an antithesis. The university was supposed to embody this sense of uh, great ability, great intelligence that was supposedly the antithesis of what disability is. And you can see even in this postcard, which is included in Dolmage's book, even architecturally, universities were often conceived of as in this rather inaccessible way. So this book again was helpful for me thinking about how libraries are embedded in a certain place historically and where we are working and where we are carrying out our mission. So one of the things that I ended up starting last year is I began working on a contribution to the Scholarly Communication Notebook, which is a project where I'm hoping to create an OER that documents the accessibility work that is happening in libraries and especially library publishing. And so the remainder of my presentation is really talking about some of the conversations I've had as part of that project, and also some of the questions that I've been asking, and also some of the roles that I feel like I've been sort of surfacing in these conversations for what libraries can do related to accessibility. So one thing that I often heard in these conversations was how our mission in libraries can guide us towards accessibility. I was able to talk to Reggie Raju, who was a previous LPC fellow, and talked a little bit about the sort of burgeoning library publishing work in South Africa. And he talked about how the projects that the open textbook projects that they've worked on have often really been driven by this need to reach students where they're at. So for students who might not have a lot of experience with a certain topic or might have intermittent and inconsistent internet access, accessibility features like having multiple file types and audio formats were really important and therefore were built into the creation of these books. Another role I heard about for libraries and the conversations I had was in having libraries and library publishers as advocates for accessibility. So one example of this came from the Accessibility Interest Group that grew out of the Scholarly Communication Institute. And this group formed to really advocate with PKP or the Public Knowledge Project to make open journal systems more accessible. Um, I think for libraries, we're often positioned between developers and users and have a real potential to kind of bridge that gap and communicate on both sides. As part of advocacy as well, I often heard about libraries advocating for accessibility with faculty members and students at universities. So the image I have here on this slide is showing a tool that one library developer systems person had talked to me about using. This is Chrome Lens, and so it's a tool that visually shows people what it's like to navigate a web page using only a keyboard. So this is basically the tabbing path on a web page. In this case, of course, I chose a publisher web page. And what this image really kind of shows is how complex or kind of tedious it is to get to the download button for this particular article. So I heard about how tools like this are really useful as part of advocacy, but also about how library developers, driven by our mission in libraries, can address some of this in the way that we create our own systems and tools. So another thing that I really learned in this last couple of years was about, um, I guess, learning about accessibility within community. As part of the fellowship, one of the key things that we do is we have mentors. And I was able to have Anita Walls at Virginia Tech University as my mentor and a person who I was able to have a lot of conversations with about work they're doing at Virginia Tech with accessibility in STEM. And one of the things I really loved about this was that for both Anita and I think we're still kind of processing what we're learning about accessibility. And it was a real opportunity to share even the things that we didn't have perfect answers to. And it felt like a really meaningful experience to be able to do that, even though we hadn't sort of realized the answer to all things. Something else I heard about from library publishers or people publishing library like content was about creative solutions for common barriers to accessibility. In this case, I have an image of the Helen Keller archive. Because so with this group that put all of this digital content documenting Helen Keller's life online, they were very interested in ensuring accessibility. And even though they had staffing and financial constraints, they found ways of improving accessibility using tools like crowdsourcing platforms where they had people help them, for instance, correct OCRing and provide transcriptions of some of their materials. And so I loved hearing about those kind of examples of libraries looking for these small kind of creative solutions. One of the roles I would love to see libraries fill even more going into the future is really moving away from a checklist-based mentality around accessibility. I think often in universities, I've seen this sort of approach where we'll talk about how accessibility is important because we're going to get sued. And here's a checklist to sort of, check everything off and then we're good. And I think that in libraries, we have the real potential to center lived experiences of people with disabilities to kind of offset that approach. Um, on this slide, I included an image taken from WebAIM that really points out the um, how it doesn't really work appealing to guilt as well as it does appealing to sort of inspiration and enlightenment and some of those higher order things. And yeah, I would love to see libraries kind of take a bit of a different take on this going forward in the future. The last thing I'll mention in terms of roles for libraries is I would love to see us talk about diversifying our teams. I think there are a lot of conversations about expanding user testing to get perspectives of people with disabilities. And I think that's great, but I would also love to see more conversations about hiring practices and how we can bring people into our teams that have these perspectives and can really enrich what we're able to offer. I included on this slide a couple of images taken from a project in Edinburgh. I'm sure there are many examples of this kind of thing, but for this particular project, there was a team of kind of curators built up, including people with low vision and people who are blind, who helped research the histories of a group of Edwardian blind people and kind of fill in those histories. And the cool thing about this project is that the team, partly because of the way it was made up, uh, was interested in distributing the information about the project in multiple formats, including in podcasts and not just in sort of articles published online. So I think we're all familiar with how effective and how lovely it is to have diversity on teams, and that's just one small example of what it can do for our organizations, I think. So finally, I wanted to end on this slide. with this quote from Mia Mingus, where she talks about moving away from an individualized and independence framed notion of access towards working on access in a collective and interdependent fashion. And I wanted to end with this quote partly because I think it parallels my personal experience and my personal thinking about disability and accessibility. And also because I feel like the experience in the LPC fellowship has also really brought to me some of those advantages and some of the really great things about looking at these problems or these types of things within community. And so that's something that I am excited about continuing on in the future. So finally, I mentioned briefly the Scholarly Communication Notebook project, and that is still underway. So I am going to put out there kind of a plug for anybody who might have a small accessibility case study. That's what I'm calling them, uh, about accessibility in library publishing. If you're willing or interested in sharing that with me, I'd love to hear from you. Um, and of course, I'd love to hear from you regardless if you would like to get in touch. So my email right now is on the screen. And thanks so much.